if you're going to send CUI over the fence to a contractor, a non-federal organization, then that information has value, and that value doesn't change when it goes from the federal side to the private sector side. So we had to come up with a set of requirements or controls that federal agencies could use when they were in that situation. And that was the initial genesis of 80171.
This is a Security Weekly production. Security Weekly is a resource of Cyber Risk Alliance.
The Cybersecurity Collaborative and Google Chrome Enterprise is proud to present CSO Stories. Each week, CSO Stories takes a deep dive on security leadership with one of the contributors to my latest book, the #1 best-selling CSO Compass, Navigating Cybersecurity Leadership Challenges with Insights from Pioneers, as well as from other top CSOs and cybersecurity thought leaders. Listen to previous CSO Stories episodes at securityweekly.com/CSP. The Cybersecurity Collaborative is a unique membership community enabling cybersecurity leaders to work together in a trusted environment. To learn more, visit securityweekly.com/CSC or visit cyberleadersunite.com. I'm your host, Todd Fitzgerald, and this week we welcome Dr. Ron Ross, fellow at NIST, and author and co-author of many of the documents at NIST, including the latest 800-171 update.
Well, thanks for having me, Todd. Really appreciate that. My journey to cybersecurity actually happened quite by accident. I was in the Army, and the Army had a program they were developing this was probably back in the mid-1980s. They were sending officers to school to learn artificial intelligence and robotics as part of a computer science program. And the intent was to make these officers program managers. The Army had a really large autonomous vehicle program back in the mid-80s. So they called me up and said, "You want to go to school and get your PhD in computer science?" And I said, "Well, I'm not sure about that, but let me think about it." It's a daunting task when you're in the Army and they call you. But I decided to go ahead with it, and I went ahead and I graduated. And the day that I was supposed to leave for my assignment, I get a call from the headquarters Department of Army, and they say, "Hey, the guy that is in the position that you're going to be backfilling has decided to stay another year. So go find yourself something else to do." And it kind of blindsided me, but I called up some of my buddies who happened to be working at the National Security Agency at the time. And I said, "Hey, you guys got any jobs over there for computer guys?" And they said, "We have tons of jobs." And I ended up going to NSA for my actual assignment, and I knew nothing about computer security, literally nothing. Wow. But what I always tell people is that in the world today, if you get grounded in the fundamentals, no matter what you're going to do, take time to learn and really get grounded in the fundamentals. In my case, it was computer science, and that has all the different components of networking, software engineering, hardware, electrical engineering. They were all these courses rolled together kind of under a STEM umbrella. And it just gives you a really good background and grounding. And then, you're going to have changes that are going to hit you, blindside you in anybody's career, especially young people. They're going to go through a lot of change. And my message is, don't run away from the change. It's going to happen. Prepare yourself. And that's why my two kind of life lessons are work really, really hard to get grounded in the basics, I call it the blocking and tackling, and whatever you're doing. And then be a life learner. Never stop learning about whatever field you choose to be in. And with those two pieces of advice, they've really done well by me. I've loved every day in cybersecurity since I started. It's going to be 32 years now. Mm-hmm. Every day I love to get up and find the next challenge. So it's just a great field. It combines so many technical and policy-related issues. There's really something for everybody in this field. Some people end up being CISOs, and others are security engineers. But no matter what your role is, all of us are playing a critical role in moving this discipline forward and supporting what I consider the most important mission. It goes right to our national security and our economic security, all rolled into one. And if you can be part of that, a change maker and contributing, it doesn't get any better.
I think that's just a great perspective. And getting that grounding and not being afraid of those changes. And what's interesting, what you said, is that you started off in AI, and it's fascinating to me because you also mentioned that was in the 1990s, where today AI is all we seem to be talking about with ChatGPT and the other generative AI engines.
Right. Well, AI, actually, when I first started in the master's program, before I went into the PhD program, we were studying artificial intelligence at the school I was at as part of the computer science department. That was back in the early 80s. So AI was around for a long, long time. In the early years, there was a lot of hype, the over-promising and under-delivering. But I think in the past decade or so, it's really started to come into its own. And it's going to provide some great new innovations, and then there's some things that are going to be causes of concern. In the world of cybersecurity now, I think one of the concerns we have is using the AI technology for searching and finding new vulnerabilities or new weaknesses and deficiencies in systems that are large and complex. And then some of those weaknesses and deficiencies, if they're exploitable, that they turn into vulnerabilities. So if there is very sophisticated AI software looking and trying to seek those out, they could be a great generator for zero-day vulnerabilities at a scale that we haven't seen before. So my solution to that is I go back to almost my every answer to every question now. It gets back to good systems engineering and good security engineering. Those are the two things that I call that working below the waterline, where you're looking at the actual development of hardware, software, firmware, and systems that come together with a capability. And the only way you can deal with these growing number of massive vulnerabilities, because the systems are so complex, we're talking trillions of lines of code, billions of devices, and everything is interconnected, whether it's a smartphone or a tablet or a supercomputer. We are all connected over this vast network. And when you have that kind of complexity, that is a field day for the adversaries. And the only way you get your arms around that is to build more solid foundational components and systems that are engineered to eliminate many of those weaknesses and deficiencies, just like good software engineering. Most of our problems in cybersecurity today are through poor software engineering. You're not applying secure coding techniques. Software is being produced very quickly because time to market is everything for the commercial marketplace. But I think we're reaching a tipping point now where it's kind of a continuum. I don't want to have regulation because that can stifle innovation on one hand. If I run open and don't have anything to say about anything, or just let the market take its way, well, then you end up with components that don't have a lot of trustworthiness or assurance, and you're really not sure what's going on. And I call it the black box. That's kind of a metaphor for any kind of a computing system where you're using it, you have a user interface, but you really don't know what's going on inside the black box. That's the hardware, the software, the firmware. And unless and until we can get better transparency and a way of understanding what kind of evidence can be brought forward to demonstrate that a vendor, a developer, has done certain fundamental things to reduce and manage those weaknesses and deficiencies, then we're flying blind. And it was okay to fly blind a decade or so ago when you got the blue screen of death. Your computer crapped out, but nobody died. These computers now are in everything that matters with total dependence on the computing technology. Smartphones, pacemakers, power plants, automobile braking systems. It's really hard to find anything today where cyber and physical systems convergence is not taking place at an astonishing rate. We love the technology, we're addicted to it, but we're going to have to do this balancing act of, I don't want to regulate, but I also want to have some assurance that the things that I'm buying from commercial industry, I know at least a little bit about those and how dangerous they might be if I use that component or the other component in a critical system where if it fails, literally people can get injured or die, or there could be some kind of severe or catastrophic consequence. So that's, to me, the biggest challenge today is managing that complexity as it relates to cybersecurity.
So we are so interconnected today, and in fighting this cyber war that we're really in today, and protecting the nation's most sensitive information, NIST has recently led an update of the 800-171 documentation. Could you walk us through, who that applies to, and what's the scope of that effort?
Sure. The SP 800-171 is all about protecting controlled, unclassified information. Around 2010, there was an executive order that came out, and it assigned the National Archives and Records Administration to the task doing two things. They had to get their arms around all the different information types that we process, store, and transmit within the federal government. And there were literally hundreds and hundreds of those. And so they took on a fairly large and complex project, got all the federal agencies together, and they agreed on 82 categories and subcategories of what we call CUI. This could be personally identifiable information, personal health information, contractor sensitive information. It could be design documentation, nuclear security information. It's any information that is called out by a government-wide, a law, a government-wide policy, or a regulation that requires special protection and handling considerations. So in the federal government, we have three different buckets we work with. We have classified information, which is controlled by statute. We have controlled unclassified information, which is now defined by NARA. And then we have everything else. The other half of NARA's job was to define the protection requirements for CUI. Now, on the federal side, we use our NIST 853 security controls, and the minimum level of protection for CUI is what we call our moderate baseline. That's a set of controls that NIST publishes that our customers can use as a starting point for doing their tailoring activities and bringing that control set down to a point where it matches the organization's mission, environment of operation, or the technologies that they're using. So that was clicking along just fine on the federal side. But now the question becomes, as the federal government starts to outsource more, for example, we're going to the cloud in a big way. We have the FedRAMP program now. The FedRAMP program defines a specific set of security controls that every cloud provider, if they want to have federal information put into the cloud, they have to comply with the set of controls as part of the FedRAMP program. There's a third-party assessment that takes place to determine if they've met the requirements, the controls that are stated. And then once they do that, they become part of the FedRAMP repository. And you can go out there and then use that FedRAMP cloud service, whether it's infrastructure, software, or platform as a service. Now, if it's not a cloud environment, then what do you do? If you're going to send CUI over the fence to a contractor, a non-federal organization, then that information has value, and that value doesn't change when it goes from the federal side to the private sector side. So we had to come up with a set of requirements or controls that federal agencies could use when they were in that situation. And that was the initial genesis of 800-171. We didn't want to use the moderate baseline because the CUI executive order only pertained to protecting the confidentiality of CUI. So we wanted to protect from unauthorized disclosure. And as it turns out, we did a lot of tailoring, and that ended up being the initial version of 800-171. I think it came out around 2015. Well, fast forward now, it's been out for about 8 years. NIST has done a lot of updates on our 853 catalog, and our moderate baseline has changed dramatically. So now we had to go back and update the 800-171 so it was in sync with the NIST catalog of controls that the federal government uses to protect CUI. And that was the major driver for this update.
The article this podcast is based upon can be viewed in the best-selling cybersecurity leadership book, CISO Compass, Navigating Cybersecurity Leadership Challenges with Insights from Pioneers. What are some of those things that, what are some of those key changes that have been made to this version versus the prior version?
Well, one of the things we heard from our customers, we did a call for comments last summer, and we typically do this. We want to get a sense of what our customers are thinking about the publication we're about to update. We want their input, and a lot of times the input drives the changes that we make. One of the comments we got was NIST has a lot of great stuff, but there's a lot of it. We have the cybersecurity framework, we have the risk management framework, we have the privacy framework, we have the 800-171. They said, could you maybe consolidate some of that? So 800-171 is derived from the NIST 853 security controls. So we thought, instead of having this level of indirection where we kind of translate the controls into these 800-171 requirements with our tailoring, let's over time try to move back to that 853 language directly. So our federal customers and the non-federal organizations who are working with the feds in the CUI world are looking at the same type of terminology, the same language, the same structure of the controls. So you're going to see in 800-171 Rev 3, we've taken a big step kind of moving back to that original structure in 853. We've also incorporated something called organization-defined parameters in those requirements. And all that is a variable part of the requirement. So for example, if one of our requirements asks you to back up your system every so often, we don't want to hardwire that time period into the requirement, because every organization may have a different backup requirement. So that variable will stand in that requirement, and we do this a lot in 853, until the organization defines the parameter. Some organizations may say, we're going to back our systems up every day or every hour. Other ones may say, hey, we'll do it once a month. But once they pick that parameter, they instantiate that variable then becomes part of the requirement, and they will be assessed against that total requirement. So that was a big change. It allows us to have greater specificity with those requirements, which is important for the implementer, so they know exactly what we're asking them to do when they implement that requirement. It's also good for the assessors, so they know how to assess. There's enough detail there so the assessment can proceed and they can do the assessment well and give back good results to the organization who implemented. So it kind of overall, when you have greater specificity in the requirements now, it sets the level of expectations at a level that both parties can understand. And that's really one of the key things we try to do with this update.
And I noticed that there's derived requirements in the document as well. What do those represent?
Well, we actually eliminated the term derived requirements. In the original 800-171, all the requirements were broken down into kind of two different flavors, if you will. There were a set of basic requirements that came from our original FIPS 200. That was the minimum security requirements for federal information and information systems. They were stated at a very high level of granularity, very high level. Now, they covered all the different families for, like, access control, identification, authentication, system communications, and all the basic families had these high-level basic requirements. Now, in access control, for example, underneath that basic requirement, or a couple of requirements, you might have 5 or 6 or 7 what we call derived requirements. The derived requirements came from the security controls, in particular in 853. It provides additional detail as far as how do you implement access control safeguards and countermeasures to satisfy that higher level requirement. The problem with that is, though, there's some overlap and redundancy. When you have the basic requirement and the derived in the same set, there's this innate redundancy that occurs because the derived are just really drilling down deeper on the basic requirements. So we decided, as we go back to the 853 now, we don't have a need for the basic and derived distinction. We're just bringing the specific requirements right out of the 853, and it'll be almost a one-for-one mapping from the 53 over to the 800-171 Rev 3 security requirements. So you can see we're gradually moving back to that source set of material, so it'll be easier on our customers, and they can also get, I think, a better set of requirements.
Yeah, I think the 853 controls are great. I worked with Medicare as part of a Medicare contractor for 10 years. and we had to implement those while, at the time when those were being developed, and we were implementing those. So how do we separate? You mentioned the non-federal systems. So Medicare contractor, for example, was contracted by the government and had to adhere to the 853 controls. So
Right.
They wouldn't be, as I understand this correctly, they wouldn't be subject to the 800-171 set because they're already covered under there? Or how do we differentiate, I guess, who?
Well, the federal agency the federal agency who's working with that contractor, they have to make a decision on whether, under FISMA, the law has very specific requirements and language that talks about a federal information system. That can be one that's owned and operated by the federal government, or it could be operated by a contractor on behalf of the federal government. This could be this in the case you mentioned, the Medicare. Some of the healthcare contractors out there may be operating systems that are actually federal information systems. If the federal agency determines that's the case, then they're under the full weight of the law under FISMA. And that would mean that they would have to comply. That in essence is a federal information system. So all of the baselines that are in the NIST 853 Bravo document and all of the controls that are identified by the federal agency that they would be actually implementing if they were doing it themselves, all that gets transferred out to the contractor's environment. Now, if it's not a federal information system or the contractor is not operating the system on behalf of the feds, then you get into this other area in the non-federal world. The non-federal organizations are operating non-federal systems. So that determination has to be made early and by the federal agency that's going to be working with the contractor. But once that decision is made, then you know which fork in the road you're turning down. And so if you're turning down the fork that's the non-federal system, then the 800-171 will come into play. Now, it's still, when NIST writes a special publication, that doesn't become a mandatory publication unless it's called out by a federal regulation of some type. So, for example, in the DoD world with the CMMC program and some of their previous regulations in the DFARS, they have called out the NIST 871 directly in that regulation. And that really brings the force of the regulation or the law or the policy in it kind of, I use the term weaponized as the NIST guidelines, because without that, it's just a guidance document and you can follow it and we hope you get benefit out of it. But when it gets put into one of those things like a regulation, then it has the throw weight that the regulation is providing. But that's a point that some folks miss sometimes.
Do you see the 171, is that in some other laws? Like, is that in HIPAA or being considered in HIPAA or, GLBA or some of the other laws?
It's hard to say. We try to stay away from prognostication in that area because every federal agency is different. They're the lawmakers in Congress. They have their own responsibilities and authorities and writing laws, and then we have OMB can produce policies. We have DHS that can do the binding operational directives. There can also be regulations produced by DoD under the DFARS or the FAR. So it's hard to say which organization is going to end up pointing to the 171. We have one clear example in the DoD for the defense industrial base, but it's hard to predict what's going to happen in the other space.
Sure. Well, this has been great, Ron. I could talk all day with you about the great work that NIST has done. I mean, I recommend their documentation all the time to be leveraged, not just here, but it's used around the world. It's very respected.
I appreciate that very much, Todd. Thanks for having me today. I really appreciate you doing the podcast and appreciate being here.
Thank you. And is there any final advice that you give to emerging CISOs, current CISOs, experienced CISOs as they're trying to navigate these regulations?
Well, I think what I always tell especially anybody who's in a CISO job or working for a CISO, it's a very, very difficult and challenging job. As you know, you work with a lot of CISOs out there. And I would just recommend to them that they don't get overwhelmed with the enormity of the job. There's so many parts of cybersecurity that are difficult and complex that you almost have to take it and break it down into manageable pieces and attack one piece at a time. And I would also say build on small successes. You cannot take on a job of a CISO and try to solve every problem of the organization, even though sometimes they expect you to do that. That's why the life expectancy of CISOs is not that long, because their job is very stressful and it takes a lot out of you to bring everything you have to that company or that federal agency. But break it down into small, achievable tasks, and then build on small successes. Tout those successes and use those to get additional funding, resources, but show a game plan of where you want to go and how you're proceeding to the end of that journey. That's the best you can do in this complicated world. Nobody can expect anybody to come in and have a perfectly secure program. In fact, even when you do everything right, sometimes the adversaries still get you because they're working one step ahead and they have that advantage of picking the time, the place, the intensity of the attack. So our jobs in essence, especially on the front lines, and I tip my hat to everybody out there who is in cybersecurity, either as a CISO or writing policy or doing vulnerability scanning, working on the front lines of wherever you might be. They're the ones that deserve the kudos, and they're doing the heavy lifting. My job is the easy part. And I think if they follow those basic ideas, breaking stuff down, showing small successes, and then just don't get discouraged, because this is not going to be a fight that's over in one day. It's going to be a long, long battle leading to hopefully the day we'll win this war, whether it's a cyber war or a combination of cyber and kinetic. We want to be prepared for whatever comes at us in this very complicated world.
I think that's a great place to leave it. Great insight. And thanks a lot, Ron, for taking the time today.
Thanks, Todd. Appreciate it. Take care.
Are you constantly thinking about how to keep your enterprise as secure as possible? Get to know Chrome Enterprise, the browser that will secure your organization without the added expense and complexity of additional browsers. Its simplified management features will free up your team to focus on critical security tasks that can be overlooked because of time and attention it takes to manage other solutions. Don't settle for a browser that compromises your organization. Visit securityweekly.com/Chrome now to start protecting your organization like never before.